Alright, so I'm going to be reading the Book of Lost Things, but only from page 215 to page 247. I'm going to start at the bottom of page 214. If you haven't read that part of the book yet, you probably don't want to listen to this. Lightning, go to bed. He lit the arrow from his flaming torch, then aimed for one of the channels of oil below. The arrow shot from the bow and struck the black stream. Instantly flames arose, the fire racing across the square, following the patterns that had been cut into it. The creatures in its path began to burn, sizzling and writhing as they died. Roland took a second arrow and fired into a cottage through its window, but nothing happened. Already, David could see some of the young people trying to escape from the square and the flames. They could not be allowed to return to the forest. Roland notched a final arrow in his bow, drew it against his cheek, and released it. This time there was a loud explosion from inside the cottage, and its roof was lifted off by the force of the blast. Flames shot up into the air, and there were more explosions as the system of barrels that Roland had created inside the houses ignited one after the other, showering burning liquid all over the square and killing everything within reach. Only Roland and David were saved, high in their perch in the bell tower, for the flames could not reach the church. There they stayed, the stink of the burning creatures and the smell of acrid smoke filling the air, until there was only the dying crackle of the flames and the soft whisper of snow melting in fire to disturb the silence of the night. That was the end of that chapter, and this is chapter 22. That's what XXII is, right? Yeah, okay. 22. Chapter 22, of the Crooked Man and the Sowing of Doubt. David and Roland left the village next morning. By then the snow had ceased falling, and although thick drifts still masked the lay of the land, it was possible to pick out the route that concealed road took between the tree-covered hills. The women, children, and old men had returned from their hiding places in the caves. David could hear some of them crying and wailing as they stood before the smoldering ruins of what were once their homes, or mourning those who had been lost, for 3 men had died fighting the beast. Others had gathered in the square, where the horses and oxen were once again being pressed into service, this time to haul away the charred carcasses of the beast and her foul offspring. Roland had not asked David why he thought the beast had chosen to pursue him through the village, but David had seen the soldier looking at him thoughtfully as they prepared to depart. Fletcher, too, had seen what had occurred, and David knew that he was also curious. David was not sure how he would answer the question if it was asked. How could he explain his sense that the beast was familiar to him, that there was a corner of his imagination where the creature had found an echo of herself? What frightened him most of all was the feeling that he had somehow been responsible for her creation, and the deaths of the soldiers and the villagers were now on his conscience. When Scylla was saddled, and they had scraped together some food and fresh water, Roland and David walked through the village to the gates. Few of the villagers came to wish them well. Most chose instead to turn their backs upon the departing travelers, or stared balefully at them from the ruins. Only Fletcher seemed truly sorry to see them go. "I apologize for the behavior of the rest," he said. "They should show more gratitude for what you have done." "They blame us for what happened to their village," said Roland to Fletcher. "Why should they be grateful to those who took the roofs from above their heads?" Fletcher looked embarrassed. "There are those who would say the beast followed you, and that you should have never been allowed to enter the village in the first place," he said. He glanced at David quickly, unwilling to meet his eye. "Some have spoken about the boy, and how the beast attacked him instead of you. They say that he is cursed, and we are well rid of him and you." "Are they angry with you for bringing us here?" asked David, and Fletcher seemed slightly thrown off by the boy's solicitude. "If they are, then they will soon forget. Already we are planning to send men into the forest to cut down trees. We will rebuild our homes. The wind saved most of the houses to the south and west, and we will share our living spaces with one another until we have rebuilt. In time they will come to realize that, had it not been for you, there would be no village at all, and many more would have died in the jaws of the beast and her young." Fletcher handed Roland a sack of food. "I can't take this," said Roland. You will all have need of it. With the beast dead, the animals will return, and we will have prey to hunt once again." Roland thanked him, and prepared to turn Scylla to the east. "You are a brave young man," Fletcher said to David. "I wish there was something more that I could give you, but all I could find was this." In his hand he held what looked like a blackened hook. He gave it to David. It was heavy, and had the texture of bone. "It is one of the beast's claws," said Fletcher. "If anyone ever questions your bravery, or you feel your courage ebb, take it in your hand and remember what you did here." David thanked him and stored the claw in his pack. Then Roland spurred Scylla on, and they left the ruins of the village behind them. They rode in silence through the twilight world, its appearance rendered more spectral yet by the fallen snow. Everything seemed to glow with a bluish tinge, and the land appeared both brighter and yet more alien. It was very cold, and their breath hung heavily in the air. David felt the little hairs in his nostrils freeze, and the moisture from his breath formed crystals of ice upon his eyelashes. Roland rowed slowly, taking care to keep Scylla away from ditches and drifts for fear that she might injure herself. "Roland," said David at last, "there's something that's been bothering me. You told me you were just a soldier, but I don't think that's true." "Why do you say that?" asked Roland. "I saw how you gave orders to the villagers, and how they obeyed you, even the ones who weren't sure they liked you. I have seen your armor and your sword. I thought that the decoration on them was just bronze or colored metal, but when I looked more closely I could see that it was gold. The sun symbol on your breastplate and your shield is made of gold, and there is gold on your scabbard and on the hilt of your sword. How can that be, if you are just a soldier?" Roland did not answer for a time. Then he said, "I was once more than a soldier. My father was lord of a vast estate, and I was the eldest son and heir. But he did not approve of me or the way I lived my life. We argued, and in a fit of anger he banished me from his presence and from his lands. It was not long after our fight that my quest for Raphael began." David wanted to ask more, but he sensed that whatever lay between Roland and Raphael was private and very personal. To pursue it further would have been rude, and would have been hurtful to Roland. "And you?" asked Roland. "Tell me more about yourself and your home." And David did. He tried to explain some of the wonders of his own world to Roland. He told him of airplanes and radio, of cinemas and cars. He spoke of the war, of the conquest of nations, and the bombing of cities. If Roland thought these things were extraordinary, he did not show it. He listened to them the way an adult might listen to a child's constructed tales, impressed that a mind could create such fantasies, but reluctant to share their creator's belief in them. He seemed more interested in what the woodsman had told David of the king, and of the book that held his secrets. "I too have heard that the king knows a great deal about books and stories," said Roland. "His realm may be falling to pieces with him, but he always has time for talk of tales. Perhaps the woodsman was right to try to lead you toward him." "If the king is weak, as you say, then what will happen to his kingdom when he dies?" asked David. "Does he have a son or daughter who will succeed him?" "The king has no children," said Roland. "He has ruled for a very long time, since before I was born, but he has never taken a wife." "And before him?" asked David, who had always been interested in kings and queens, and kingdoms and knights. "Was his father king?" Roland struggled to remember. "There was a queen before him, I think. She was very, very old, and she announced that a young man, one whom nobody had ever seen before, but who was soon to come, would rule the realm in her place. That was what happened, according to those who were alive then. Within days of the young man's arrival, he was king, and the queen went to her bed and fell asleep, and never woke again. They say that she seemed almost grateful to die." They came to a stream frozen over by the plummeting temperature, and they decided to rest for a short while. Roland used the hilt of his sword to break the ice so that Scylla could drink from the water beneath. David wandered along the edge of the stream while Roland ate. He was not hungry. Fletcher's wife had given him great slabs of homemade bread and jam for breakfast that morning, and they were still sitting in his stomach. He sat on a rock, and dug in the snow for stones to throw upon the ice. The snow was deep, and soon his arm was buried in it. His finger touched some pebbles, and a hand shot out of the snow beside him and gripped him just above the elbow. It was white and thin, with long, jagged nails, and with enormous force it pulled him from the rock and into the snow. David opened his mouth to yell for help, but a second hand appeared and clamped itself across his lips. He was dragged beneath the drift, the snow falling on top of him so that he could no longer see the trees and sky above, the hands never loosening their hold upon him. He felt hard ground at his back and was overcome by a terrible sense of suffocation, and then the earth too collapsed, and he found himself in a hollow of dirt and stone. The hands released him, and a light shone through the darkness. Tree roots hung from above, gently caressing his face, and David saw the openings of 3 tunnels, their mouths converging on this one spot. Yellowing bones lay in one corner, the flesh that had once covered them long since rotted or consumed. There were worms and beetles and spiders all around, scurrying and fighting and dying in the moist, cold earth. And there was the crooked man. He squatted in a corner, one of those pale hands that had dragged David down now, holding a lamp, while the other gripped a huge black beetle. As David watched, the crooked man put the struggling insect into his mouth, head first, and bit it in half. He chewed on the beetle, all the time watching David. The bottom half of the insect kept moving for a few seconds, then stopped. The crooked man offered it to David. David could see parts of its insides. They were white, and he felt very sick. "Help me!" he shouted. "Roland, please help me!" But there was no reply. Instead, the vibrations of his cries merely dislodged dirt from the roof of the hollow. It fell on his head and into his mouth. David spit it out, then prepared to shout again. "Oh, I wouldn't do that," said the crooked man. He picked at his teeth and extracted a long black beetle leg that had lodged close to his gums. "The ground here isn't stable, and with all the snow above, well, I don't like to think what would happen if it came down on top of you. You'd die, I expect, and not very pleasantly." David closed his mouth. He did not want to be buried alive down there with the insects and the worms and the crooked man. The crooked man worked on the lower half of the beetle, removing its back to expose its innards entirely. "Are you sure you don't want any?" he asked. "They're very good, crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside. Sometimes, though, I find that I don't want crunchy. I just want soft." He lifted the insect's body to his mouth and sucked at its flesh, then threw the husk into a corner. "I thought that you and I should talk," he said, "without the risk of your, friend up there interrupting us. I don't think you've fully grasped the nature of your predicament. You still seem to think that allying yourself with every passing stranger will help you, but it won't, you know. I'm the reason you're still alive, not some ignorant woodsman or disgraced knight." David couldn't bear to hear the man who had helped him dismissed like that. "The woodsman wasn't ignorant," he said, "and Roland argued with his father. He isn't a disgrace to anyone." The crooked man grinned unpleasantly. "Is that what he told you? Tut, tut, have you seen the picture he carries in his locket? Raphael, isn't that the name of the one whom he seeks? Such a nice name for a young man. They were very close, you know. Ooh, very close." David didn't know quite what the crooked man meant, but the way he spoke made David feel dirty and soiled. "Perhaps he would like you to be his new friend," continued the crooked man. "He looks at you at night, in the night, you know, when you're asleep. He thinks you're beautiful. He wants to be close to you, and closer than close." "Don't talk about him that way," warned David. "Don't you dare." The crooked man sprang from the corner, leaping like a frog, and landed in front of David. His bony hand grasped the boy's jaw painfully, the nails digging into his skin. "Don't tell me what to do, child," he said. "I could tear your head off if I chose and use it to adorn my dinner table. I could bore a hole in your skull and stick a candle in it once I'd eaten my fill of whatever was inside, which wouldn't be much, I expect. You're not a very bright boy, are you? You enter a world you don't understand, chasing the voice of someone you know is dead. You can't find your way back again, and you insult the only person who can help you return, namely, me. You are a very rude, ungrateful, and ignorant little boy." With a snap of his fingers, the crooked man produced a long, sharp needle threaded with coarse black string made from what looked like the knotted legs of dead beetles. "Now, why don't you work on your manners before you force me to sew your lips shut?" He released his grip on David's face, then patted his cheek gently. "Let me show you a proof of my good intentions," he purred. He reached into the leather pouch upon his belt and drew from it the snout that he had severed from the wolf scout. He dangled it in front of David. "It was following you, and it found you as soon as you emerged from the church in the forest. It would have killed you, too, had I not intervened. Where it went, others will follow. They are on your trail and growing even greater in number. More and more of them are transforming now, and they cannot be stopped. Their time is coming. Even the king knows it, and he does not have the strength to stand in their way. It would be well for you to be back in your own world before they find you again, and I can help you. Tell me what I want to know, and you will be safe in your bed before nightfall. All will be well in your house, and your problems will have been solved. Your father will love you, and you alone. This I can promise you if you answer just one question." David didn't want to bargain with the crooked man. He couldn't be trusted, and David felt certain that he was keeping many things from him. No deal made with him could ever be simple or without cost. Yet David also knew that much of what he was saying was true. The wolves were coming, and they would not stop until they found David. Roland would not be able to kill them all. Then there was the beast. Terrible though she was only one of the horrors that this land seemed to conceal. There would be others, perhaps worse than Loops or Beast. Wherever David's mother was now, in this world or another, she seemed beyond his reach. He could not find her. He had been foolish ever to think he could, but he wanted so badly for it to be true. He wanted her to be alive again. He missed her. Sometimes he would forget her, but in forgetting he would remember her again, and the ache for her would return with a vengeance. Yet the answer to his loneliness did not lie in this place. It was time to go home. And so David spoke. "What do you want to know?" he said. The crooked man leaned toward him and whispered, "I want you to tell me the name of the child in your house," he said. "I want you to name for me your half-brother." David's fear was replaced by puzzlement. "But why?" he said. If the crooked man was the same figure he had seen in his bedroom, then wasn't it possible that he had been in other parts of the house too? David remembered how he had awoken at home with the unpleasant sensation that something or someone had touched his face while he was asleep. A strange smell had sometimes hung about Georgie's bedroom, stranger at least than the smell that usually came from Georgie. Could it have been an indication of the crooked man's presence? Was it possible that the crooked man had failed to hear Georgie's name spoken during his incursions into their house? And why was it so important for him to know the name anyway? "I just want to hear it from your lips," said the crooked man. "It's such a small thing, such a tiny, tiny favor. Tell me, and all this will be over." David swallowed hard. He wanted so badly to go home. All he had to do was speak Georgie's name. What harm could that do? He opened his mouth to speak, but the next name spoken was not Georgie's, but his own. "David, where are you?" It was Roland. David heard the sound of digging from above. The crooked man hissed his displeasure at the intrusion. "Quickly," he said to David. "The name! Tell me the name!" Dirt fell on David's head, and a spider scurried across his face. "Tell me!" shrieked the crooked man, and then the ceiling of earth over David's head fell in, blinding and burying him. Before his sight failed, he saw the crooked man scurry for one of the tunnels to escape the collapse. There was earth in David's mouth and nose. He tried to breathe, but it caught in his throat. He was drowning in dirt. He felt strong hands grip his shoulders as he was pulled from the earth and into the clean, crisp air above. His vision cleared, but he was still choking on soil and bugs. Roland's hand pumped at David's body, forcing the earth and insects from his throat. David coughed up dirt and blood and bile and crawling things as his airways cleared, then lay on his side in the snow. The tears froze on his cheeks. His teeth were chattering. Roland knelt by his side. "David," he said, "talk to me. Tell me what happened." "Tell me. Tell me." Roland touched his hand to David's face, and David felt himself recoil. Roland, too, registered his response, for instantly he withdrew his hand and moved away from the boy. "I want to go home," David whispered. "That's all. I just want to go home." And he curled into himself upon the snow and cried until he had no tears left to shed. Chapter 23 of the March of the Wolves. David sat on Scylla's back. Roland was not riding with him, but once more led the horse by her reins along the road. There was an unspoken tension between Roland and David, and while the boy was able to recognize both Roland's hurt and its source, he could not find a way to connect the two with an apology. The crooked man had hinted at something about the relationship between Roland and the lost Raphael that David felt might be true, but he was less convinced by the implication that Roland now had similar feelings for David himself. Deep down, he was certain that it was false. Roland had shown him nothing but kindness, and if there had been an ulterior motive to his actions, it would have revealed itself long before now. He was sorry that he had recoiled from Roland's touch of solicitude, but to make the admission would have forced him to acknowledge that, even for just the blink of an eye, the crooked man's words had found their mark. It had taken David a long time to recover himself. His throat hurt when he spoke, and he could still taste dirt in his mouth, even after he had washed it out with icy water from the stream. It was only after riding in silence for a long time that he was able to tell Roland of what had taken place beneath the ground. "And that is all he asked of you?" said Roland, when David had repeated to him most of what had been uttered. "He wanted you to tell him your half-brother's name?" David nodded. "He told me I could go back home if I did." "Do you believe him?" David thought about the question. "Yes," he said. "I think he could show me the way if he wanted to." "Then you must decide for yourself what to do. Remember, though, that nothing comes without cost. The villagers learned this as they sifted through the remains of their homes. There is a price to be paid for everything, and it is a good idea to find out the price before you make the agreement. Your friend the woodsman called this fellow a trickster, and if that is what he is, then nothing he says is entirely to be trusted. Be careful in striking a bargain with him, and listen closely to his words, for he will say less than he means and conceal more than he reveals." Roland did not look back at David as he spoke, and these were the last words that they exchanged for many miles. When they stopped to rest that night, they sat at opposite sides of the small fire Roland had made, and they ate in silence. Roland had removed the saddle from Scylla's back and placed it against a tree, far from the spot where he had laid out David's blanket. "You can rest easy," he said. "I am not tired, and I will keep watch on the forest while you sleep." David thanked him. He lay down and closed his eyes, but he could not fall asleep. He thought of wolves and loops, of his father and Rose and Georgie, of his lost mother and the offer that the crooked man had made. He wanted to leave this place. If all that was required was to share Georgie's name with the crooked man, then perhaps that was what he should do. But the crooked man would not come back now that Roland was keeping watch, and David felt his anger at Roland begin to grow. Roland was using him. His promise of protection and the guidance to the king's castle had come at too great a price. David was being dragged along on a quest for a man whom he had never met, a man whom only Roland had feelings, and those feelings, if the crooked man was to be believed, were not natural. They were names for men like Roland, where David came from. They were among the worst names that a man could be called. David had always been warned to keep away from such people, and now here he was, keeping company with one of them in a strange land. Well, soon their ways would part. Roland reckoned that they would reach the castle on the following day, and that there they would finally learn the truth of Raphael's fate. After that, Roland would lead him to the king, and then their arrangement would be over. While David slept and Roland brooded, the man named Fletcher knelt at the walls of his village, his bow in his hand, a quiver of arrows by his side. Others crouched alongside him, their faces lit by torches once again, just as they had been when they had prepared to face the beast. They gazed out at the forest before them, for even in darkness it was clear to them that it was no longer empty and still. Shapes moved through the trees, thousands upon thousands of them. They padded on all fours, gray and white and black, but among them there were those that walked on 2 legs, dressed like men, but with faces that bore traces of the animals they once were. Fletcher shivered. This, then, was the wolf army of which he had heard. He had never seen so many animals moving as one before, not even when he had looked to the late summer skies and witnessed the migration of birds. Yet they were now more than animals. They moved with a purpose beyond merely the desire to hunt or breed. With the loops at their head to impose discipline and plan the campaign, they represented a fusion of all that was most terrifying about men and wolves. The king's forces would not be strong enough to defeat them on a field of battle. One of the loops emerged from the pack and stood at the edge of the forest, staring at the men hunched beneath the defenses of their little village. He was more finely dressed than the others, and even from this distance Fletcher could tell that he seemed more human than the others, although he could not yet be mistaken for a man. Leroy, the wolf who would be king. During the long wait for the coming of the beast, Roland had shared with Fletcher what he knew of the wolves and the loops, and how David had bested them. Although Fletcher wished the soldier and the boy only health and happiness, he was very glad that they were no longer within the walls of their village. Leroy knows, thought Fletcher. He knows they were here, and if he suspected they were still here with us, he would attack with the full fury of his army. Fletcher raised to his feet and stared across the open ground to the place where Leroy stood. "What are you doing?" whispered someone from close by. "I will not cower before an animal," said Fletcher. "I will not give that thing the satisfaction." Leroy nodded, as though in understanding of Fletcher's gesture, then slowly drew a clawed finger across his throat. He would be back once the king was dealt with, and they would see how brave Fletcher and the others truly were. Then Leroy turned away to rejoin the pack, leaving the men to watch impotently as the great wolf army passed through the woods on its way to seize the kingdom. Chapter 4. Of the Forest of Thorns. David awoke the next morning to find Roland gone. The fire was dead, and Scylla was no longer tied to her tree. David rose and stood where the horse's tracks disappeared into the forest. He felt concern at first, then a kind of relief, followed by anger at Roland for abandoning him without even a word of goodbye, and finally the first twinge of fear. Suddenly the prospect of confronting the crooked man alone again was not so appealing, and the possibility of the wolves coming across him was less appealing yet. He drank from his canteen. His hand was shaking. It caused him to spill water all over his shirt. He wiped at it and caught the jagged end of a fingernail on the coarse material. A thread unraveled, and as he tried to free it, his nail tore still further, causing him to yelp in pain. He threw the canteen at the nearest tree in a fit of rage, then sat down hard on the ground and buried his head in his hands. "And what purpose did that serve?" said Roland's voice. David looked up. Roland was watching him from the edge of the woods, seated high on Scylla's back. "I thought you'd left me," said David. "Why would you think that?" David shrugged. Now he was ashamed of his display of petulance and his doubts about his companion. He tried to hide it by going on the attack. "I woke up, and you were gone," he replied. "What was I supposed to think?" "That I was scouting the way ahead. I did not leave you for very long, and I believed you were safe here. There is stone not far below the ground here, so our friend could not use his tunnels against you, and at all times I was within earshot. You had no reason to doubt me." Roland dismounted and walked to where David sat, leading Scylla behind him. "Things have not been the same with us since that foul little man dragged you beneath the ground," said Roland. I think I may have some inkling of what he said to you about me. My feelings for Raphael are mine, and mine alone. I loved him, and that is all anyone needs to know. The rest is no business of any man's. As for you, you are my friend. You are brave, and you are both stronger than you look and stronger than you believe yourself to be. You are trapped in an unfamiliar land with only a stranger for company, yet you have defied wolves, trolls, a beast that had destroyed a force of armed men, and the tainted promises of the one you call the Crooked Man. Through it all I have never seen you in despair. When I agreed to take you to the king, I thought you would be a burden on me, but instead you have proved yourself worthy of respect and trust. I hope that I in turn have proved myself worthy of your respect and trust, for without it we are both lost. Now, will you come with me? We have almost reached our destination. He extended his hand to David. The boy took it, and Roland raised him to his feet. I'm sorry, said David. You have nothing to be sorry for, said Roland, but gather your belongings, for the end is near. They rode for only a short time, but as they traveled, the air around them changed. The hairs on David's head and arms stood on end. He could feel the static when he touched his hand to them. The wind blew a strange scent from the west, musty and dry, like the interior of a crypt. The land rose beneath them until they came to the brow of a hill, and there they paused and looked down. Before them, like a stain upon the snow, was the dark shape of a fortress. David thought of it as a shape rather than a fortress itself, because there was something very peculiar about it. He could make out a central tower and the walls and outbuildings, but they were slightly blurred, like the lines of a watercolor painting made on damp paper. It stood at the center of the forest, but all of the trees around it had been felled as though by some great explosion. Here and there David saw the glinting of metal upon its battlements. Birds hovered above it, and the dry smell grew stronger. Carrion birds, said Roland, pointing. They feed upon the dead. David knew what he was thinking. Raphael had entered that place, and had not returned. Perhaps you should stay here, said Roland. It will be safer for you. David looked around. The trees here were different from the others he had seen. They were twisted and ancient, their bark diseased and pitted with holes. They looked like old men and women frozen in agony. He did not want to remain alone among them. Safer? Queried David. There are wolves following me, and who knows what else lives in these woods. If you leave me here, I'll just follow you on foot anyway. I might even be useful to you in there. I didn't let you down in the village when the beast came after me, and I won't let you down now, he said with determination. Roland did not argue with him. Together they rode toward the fortress. As they moved through the fortress, they heard voices whispering. The sound seemed to come from within the trees, emerging through the openings in their trunks, but whether they were the voices of the trees themselves, or of those unseen things that dwelled within them, David could not say. Twice he believed that he saw movements in the holes, and once he was certain that eyes had stared back at him from deep inside the tree. But when he told Roland, the soldier said only, "Don't be afraid. Whatever they are, they have nothing to do with the fortress. They are not our concern unless they choose to make themselves so." Nevertheless, he slowly withdrew his sword as he rode, and let it hang by Scylla's side, ready to be used. The forest was so thick with trees that the fortress was lost from sight as they passed through them, so it came as something of a shock to David when they finally emerged into the blasted landscape of fallen trunks. The force of the explosion, or whatever it had been, had torn the trees from the ground so that their roots lay exposed above deep hollows. At the epicenter lay the fortress, and now David could see why it had appeared blurred from a distance. It was completely covered by brown creepers that wound around the central tower and covered the walls and battlements, and from the creepers emerged dark thorns, some easily a foot long and thicker than David's wrist. It might have been possible to attempt to climb the walls using the creepers, but make even the slightest misstep, and an arm or a leg, or, worse, the head or heart, would be impaled upon the waiting spikes. They rode around the perimeter of the fortress until they came to the gates. They were open, but the creepers had formed a barrier across the entrance. Through the gaps between the thorns, David could see a courtyard and a closed door at the base of the central tower. A suit of armor lay upon the ground before it, but there was no helmet, and no head. "Roland," said David, "that knight—" But Roland was not looking at the gates or the knight. His head was raised, and his eyes were fixed on the battlements. David followed his gaze and discovered what it was that had gleamed upon the walls from a distance. The heads of men had been impaled upon the topmost thorns, facing out over the gates. Some still wore their helmets, although their face guards were raised or torn off so that their expressions could be seen, while others had no armor left at all. Most were little more than skulls, and while there were 3 or 4 that were still recognizable as men, they looked as though they had no flesh left on their faces, just a thin covering of gray, papery skin over the bone. Roland examined each one in turn until, at last, until, at last, he had stared into the faces of every dead man upon the battlements. He looked relieved when he was done. "Raphael is not among those that I can identify," he said. "I see neither his face nor his armor." He dismounted and approached the entrance. Drawing his sword, he sliced off one of the thorns. It fell to the ground, and instantly another grew in its place, even longer and thicker than the one that had been severed. It grew so fast that it almost stabbed Roland in the chest before he managed, just in time, to step out of its way. Roland next tried to hack through the creeper itself, but the sword made only the slightest of cuts upon it, and the damage once again repaired itself before his eyes. Roland stepped back and returned his sword to its sheath. "There must be a way inside," he said. "How else did that knight gain admittance before he died? We will wait. We will wait, and we will watch. In time, perhaps, it will reveal its secret to us." They settled down after building a small fire to keep the cold at bay, and maintained a silent, uneasy vigil on the fortress of thorns. Night fell, or the greater darkness that merely deepened the shadows of the day and served as the night in that world. The whispering of the forest, which had continued while they circled the fortress, abruptly ceased with the coming of the moon. The carrion birds disappeared. David and Roland were alone. A faint light appeared at the topmost window of the tower, and then was blocked as a figure passed before the opening. It paused, and seemed to stare down upon the man and boy below, then disappeared. "I saw it," said Roland, before David could open his mouth. "It looked like a woman," said David. It was the enchantress, he thought, watching over the sleeping lady in the tower. The moonlight shone upon the armor of the dead men impaled on the battlements, reminding him of the danger he and Roland now faced. They must all have been armed when they approached the fortress, yet still they had died. The body of the knight that lay inside the gates was huge, taller than Roland by a foot at least, and almost as broad as him again. Whoever guarded the tower was strong and fast, and very, very cruel. Then, as they watched, the creepers and thorns blocking the gates began to move. They unraveled slowly, creating an entrance through which a man could pass. It gaped like an open mouth, and long thorns poised like teeth, waiting to bite. "It's a trap," said David. "It must be." Roland stood. "What choice do I have?" he said. "I must discover what happened to Raphael. I have not come all this way to sit on the ground and stare at walls and thorns." He placed his shield upon his left arm. He did not look frightened. In fact, he looked happier to David than he had been at any point since they had met. He had traveled from his own land to find an answer to his friend's disappearance, tormented by what might have befallen him. Whatever now happened within the fortress walls, and whether he lived or died as a result, he would at last discover the truth about the end of Raphael's journey. "Stay here and keep the fire burning," said Roland. "If I have not returned by daybreak, take Scylla and ride as fast as you can from this place. Scylla is as much your horse now as mine, for I think she loves you just as she loves me. Remain on the road, and it will lead you eventually to the castle of the king." He smiled down upon David. "It has been an honor to travel these roads with you. If we do not see each other again, I hope that you find your home, and the answers you seek." They shook hands. David did not shed a tear. He wanted to be as brave as he thought Roland to be. It was only later that he wondered if Roland was truly brave. He knew that Roland believed Raphael was dead, and that he wanted revenge upon whoever had killed him. But he also felt, as Roland walked toward the waiting fortress, that part of the knight did not want to live without Raphael, and that death, for him, would be preferable to a life alone. David accompanied Roland to the gates. As they approached, Roland gazed at the waiting thorns in apprehension, as though he feared they would close upon him as soon as he was within their reach. But they did not move, and Roland passed through their reach, without incident. He stepped over the armor of the knight and pushed upon the door of the tower. He looked back at David, raised his sword in a final farewell, and walked into shadows. The creepers on the gates twisted, and the thorns extended, restoring the barrier across the entrance of the courtyard. And then all was still once more. The crooked man watched what had transpired from his perch on the topmost branch of the tallest tree in the forest. The presences that dwelled within the tree trunks did not trouble him, for they were more scared of the crooked man than of almost any other being that dwelled in this land. The thing in the forest was ancient and cruel, but the crooked man was older, and crueler still. He stared down upon the boy seated by the fire, Scylla standing close by him, untethered, for she was brave, intelligent, and would not easily take fright or abandon her rider. The crooked man was tempted to approach David once again and ask him for the child's name, but he thought better of it. A night alone at the edge of the forest, facing the fortress of thorns and watching over by the heads of dead knights would make him more willing to bargain with the crooked man come morning. For the crooked man knew that the knight Roland would never come out of the fortress alive, and David was, once more, alone in the world. Time passed slowly for David. He fed the fire with sticks and waited for Roland to return. Sometimes he felt Scylla nuzzle his neck gently, reminding him that she was close. He was glad of the horse's presence. Her strength and her loyalty were reassuring to him. But tiredness began to overcome him, and his mind played tricks upon him. He would fall asleep for a second or two and instantly begin to dream. He glimpsed flashes of home, and incidents from the last few days replayed themselves in his mind. Their stories overlapping as wolves and dwarves and the young of the beast all became part of the same tale. He heard the voice of his mother crying out to him, and as she sometimes had when the pain had grown too great for her in her last days, and then her face was replaced by roses, just as his place in father's affections had been taken by Georgie. But was that true? He realized suddenly that he missed Georgie, and the feeling was so surprising to him that he almost awoke. He remembered the way the baby would smile at him or grasp his finger in his chubby fist. True, he was noisy and smelling and demanding, but all babies were like that. It wasn't Georgie's fault, not really. Then the image of Georgie faded, and David saw Roland, sword in hand, advancing down a long, dark hallway. He was inside the tower, but the tower itself was a kind of illusion, and hidden within it were a great many rooms and corridors, each one containing traps for the unwary. Roland entered a large circular chamber, and in his dream David saw Roland's eyes widen in disbelief, and the walls ran red as something in the shadows called David's name. David awoke abruptly. He was still by the fire, but the flames had almost died out. Roland had not returned. David got up and walked towards the gates. Scylla whinnied nervously as he moved away, but she remained by the fire. David stood before the gates, then reached out and touched his finger warily to one of the thorns. Immediately the creepers retreated, the thorns retracted, and an opening in the barrier was revealed. David looked back at Scylla and the dying embers of the fire. I should go now, he thought. I should not even wait for the dawn. Scylla will take me to the king, and he will tell me what I should do. But still he lingered before the gates. Despite what Roland had told him to do if he did not return, David did not want to abandon his friend. And as he stood facing the thorns, uncertain of how to proceed, he heard a voice calling to him. "David," it whispered, "come to me. Please come to me." It was his mother's voice. "This is the place to which I was brought," the voice continued. "When the sickness took me, I fell asleep, and I passed from our world to this one. Now she watches over me. I cannot awake, and I cannot escape. Help me, David. If you love me, please help me." "Mom," said David, "I'm afraid." "You've come so far, and you've been so brave," said the voice. "I've been watching you in my dreams. I'm so proud of you, David. Just a few steps further. Just a little more courage, that's all I ask." David reached into his pack and found the claw of the beast. He gripped it tightly in his hand before slipping it into his pocket, and thought of Fletcher's words. He had been brave once, and he would be brave again for his mother. The crooked man, still watching from the trees, realized what was happening and began to move. He leapt from his perch, descended from branch to branch, and landing like a cat upon the ground, but he was too late. David had passed into the fortress, and the barrier of thorns had closed behind him. The crooked man howled with rage, but David, already lost to the fortress, did not hear him. Alright, and then this next chapter I'm not going to be finishing, but it's chapter 25, of the Enchantress and what became of Raphael and Roland. The courtyard was cobbled with black and white stones, stained by droppings from the carrion birds that hovered above the fortress by day. Carved stairs led up to the battlements. Racks of weapons stood beside them, but the spears, swords, and shields were rusted and useless. Some of the weaponry had fantastic designs, intricate spirals and delicate interwoven chains of silver and bronze that were echoed on the hilts of the swords and the faces of the shields. David could not equate the beauty of the craftsmanship with the sinister place that now held them. It suggested that the castle had not always been as it now was. It had been taken over by a malevolent entity, a cuckoo that had turned it into a spiked, creepered nest, and its original inhabitants had either died or fled when it came. Now that he was inside, David could see signs of damage, hollow pits mostly, where the walls and courtyard had absorbed the force of cannon fire. It was clear that the castle was very old, yet the fallen trees surrounding it suggested that what Roland had heard and what Fletcher claimed to have seen, however strange, was in fact the case. The castle could move through the air, traveling to new locations with the cycles of the moon. Beneath the walls were stables, but they were empty of hay and bore no trace of the healthy animal smells that such places built up over time. Instead, there were only the bones of horses left to starve after the deaths of their masters, and the lingering stench from within was a reminder of their slow decay. Across from them, at either side of the central tower, were what might have once been guards' quarters and kitchens. Carefully, David peered through the windows of each, but both were entirely devoid of life. There were bare bunks in the guards' building and cold, empty ovens in the kitchen. Plates and mugs lay upon the tables as though a meal had been disturbed, and those who were eating had never been given a chance to return to their food. David walked to the door of the tower. The body of the knight lay at his feet, a sword still gripped in his great hand. The sword had not rusted, and the knight's armor still shone. In addition, he wore a sprig of some white flower tucked into a hole in his shoulder armor. It had not yet withered fully, so David guessed that the body had not been lying there very long. There was no blood on his neck or on the ground around him. David did not know a great deal about the mechanics of cutting off a man's head, but he imagined that there would be some blood at least. He wondered who the knight was, and whether he, like Roland, bore some device on his breastplate to identify him. The huge knight was lying chest down, and David wasn't sure that he would be able to turn him over. Still, he decided that the identity of the dead knight should not remain unknown, just in case he found a way to tell anyone of what had happened to him. David knelt down and took a breath, then pushed hard against the armor. To his surprise, the knight's remains moved quite easily. True, the armor was heavy, but not as heavy as it should have been with the body of a man inside it. Once he had managed to turn the knight over, David could see the sign of an eagle on the breastplate, a snake writhing in its talons. He rapped upon the armor with the knuckles of his right hand. The sound echoed within. It was like tapping on an empty can. It seemed that the suit of armor was empty. But no, that was not the case, for David both heard and felt something move as he rolled the armor, and when he examined the hole at the top where the head had been separated from the body, he saw bone and skin within. The top of the spinal column was white where the head had been severed from the body, but even here there was no blood. Somehow the knight's remains had been reduced to a husk inside the armor, rotting away to almost nothing so quickly that the flower he'd worn, perhaps for luck, had not yet had time to die. David considered fleeing the fortress, but he knew that even if he tried to do so, the thorns would not part for him. This was a place to be entered, but not to be left, and despite his doubts he had heard, once again, his mother's voice calling to him. If she was truly there, then he could not abandon her now. David stepped over the fallen knight and entered the tower. A set of stone stairs wound upward in a spiral. He listened intently, but could hear no sound from above. He wanted to call his mother's name, or to cry out for Roland, but he was afraid of altering the presence in the tower to his approach. Perhaps, though, whatever waited in the tower already knew that he was in the fortress, and had parted the thorns to enable him to pass through. Still, it seemed wiser to be quiet than to be noisy, and so he did not speak. He recalled the figure that had passed across the lighted window, and the tale of the enchantress who kept a woman in thrall, dooming her to an eternal, ageless sleep in a chamber of treasures unless she could be awakened by a kiss. Could that woman be his mother? The answer lay above. He drew his sword and started to climb. There were small, narrow windows every 10 steps, and these allowed a little light to filter into the tower, enabling David to see where he was going. He counted a dozen such windows before he reached the stone floor at the top of the tower. A hallway stretched before him, with open doorways on either side. From outside, the tower appeared to be 20 or 30 feet wide, but the corridor in front of him was so long that the end of it was lost in shadow. It must have been hundreds of feet in length, lit by flaming torches set into walls, yet somehow it was contained within a tower only a fraction that size. David walked slowly down the hallway, glancing into each room as he did so. Some were bedrooms, opulently furnished with enormous beds and velvet drapes. Others contained couches and chairs. One housed a grand piano, and nothing else. The walls of another were decorated with hundreds of similar versions of one painting. A painting of 2 male children, identical twins, with a painting of themselves in the background that was an exact replica of the picture they occupied, so that they stared out at infinite versions of themselves. Halfway down the hall was a vast dining room, dominated by a huge oak table with 100 chairs around it. Candles were lit along its length, and their light shone upon a great feast. There were roast turkeys and geese and ducks, and a huge pig with an apple in its mouth at the centerpiece. There were platters of fish and cold meats, and vegetables steamed in big pots. It all smelled so wonderful that David was drawn into the room, unable to resist the urgings of his growling stomach. Someone had started carving one of the turkeys, for its leg had been removed, and slivers of white meat had been cut from its breast and now lay, tender and moist, upon a plate. David picked up one of the pieces and was about to take a great bite from it when he saw an insect crawling across the table. It was a large red ant, and it was making its way toward a fragment of skin that had fallen from the turkey. It clasped the crisp brown morsel in its jaws and prepared to carry it away, but suddenly it seemed to totter on its feet, as though its burden was heavier than it had expected. It dropped the skin, wobbled a little more, then ceased moving entirely. David poked at it with his finger, but the insect did not respond. It was dead. Alright, so Kristen, that should have been the right amount of the book. I ended on page 217. I really hope this video turned out alright, and that you could hear my words. And if not, I can remake it some other time. So yeah, I hope that was alright. Bye!